Hi again. I'm going to try to get back to that video that I first started doing. If you watched the video I just uploaded, I mentioned that I first tried to answer the first question that someone left me, and my computer crashed because my battery needs to be replaced. So I lost it all. So I'm going to try to start over again with that one now that I've finished the last one. And this question is by David H071, who asked on the summer check-in video. Um, Again, thank you so much for those of you who have been responding. I really like to have questions, and I like to have things to talk about. It's so nice. Uh, so please keep them coming. It's really great. Okay, so he asked or said, uh, you have a lot of knowledge about the philosophical background of tarot. How do you know what to leave out when doing a reading, as most people just want to know basic life issues? Do you find this frustrating that you want to go deeper? How have you found the balance and things? Uh, this is a really good question. So thank you for asking it again. Really, really good question. Um, I think that it really is. It really has to be. Sorry, allergies. Um, for me, I said the first time I did this, it's sort of like, oddly enough, a lot like medieval culture, in that medieval culture was very much about the almost synonymization. I'm going to make that up. Uh, the equivalence of sacred and secular society. The two were so almost intertwined, yes, intertwined, that they were almost indistinguishable from each other. And I think that's kind of how we have to deal, or at least how I choose to deal with any tarot reading for any person whatsoever. Um, I, I sort of don't, to be completely frank, I don't really care if the person doesn't want to hear that stuff. Because, as I said the first time I did this video, um, any reading is as much about you as it is for the querent, for a few reasons. Um, First of all, I think a very important one is that any reading you do, at least in my experience, any person that comes into your life and says, please give me help in this situation, please read my tarot to help me, um, I believe has come into your life because you are somehow on a similar life path. Your problems, for whatever reason or in whatever way, align in some fashion. And that's just what I have found by doing this, doing online readings for people from all over the place. Uh, you know, Most of the time, their situations really resonate with mine at the time, and sometimes it can be really, really strange how they do. But it's undeniable in certain circumstances that their readings are clearly reflecting aspects of my situation, but in a very different way, or in almost the exact same way. It can be utterly bizarre to see, you know, to draw the cards and look at them and say, this reading is for me. What did I do wrong? And then say, well, I guess I have to just trust. And then read them for the person, send the reading off, and then they get back to you and they're like, oh, that was absolutely right. You hit all these specifics that were totally correct. And it's like, okay, sure. And it can be a really strange thing, and it's not because the reading was so general that it could be applicable to anyone, because clearly it resonated with that person in a very specific way, in the same way that it resonated with you in a very specific way. And I don't know if that's been your experience or any of you out there. I mean, I hope I'm not alone with that, because it's such a cool thing, and it really uh, can be kind of a life-changing moment. It's pretty awesome to realize that your situations really are reflected all around you, and that you're sort of like a little center of gravity around which all these experiences come into orbit around you, no matter how far away they are taking place. It can be a really beautiful thing. So that's one way a reading is as much about you as it is for them. The second way is because um, the way I teach tarot and basically um, just tell people how to do it, uh, is that, if you need to do whatever is going to make that reading most successful for the querent, and there's a nice reciprocity there. You're doing everything you can to be on your A game for your reading in order to give that querent A, the quality they deserve for what they paid for, and B, so that they can help themselves in whatever situation they're in. Because you assume that someone's coming to you for a reading because they're having some kind of issue that they want insight into. And so you want to do what's best for you so that they can do what's best for themselves based on the information that you give. And so if giving some of the philosophical stuff behind the cards is how you read and is how you're going to give your best reading and your most powerful reading to a querent, then by all means do it. If you give your most powerful readings by not doing that, by avoiding that stuff like the plague and just kind of doing total intuition stuff like many people do, and are completely successful doing that, and sometimes scarily so, by all means go for it. Really, it is as much about your success as it is about their success. And I think that's really important. So many times I hear, like, I always think back, and I've mentioned this before, but to this comment I got, because it floored me because I just didn't understand it. The way I shuffle my cards. Someone wrote on one of my videos, like, how can you shuffle like that? It's so distracting. I don't want to ever create that kind of noisy environment for my querents, and I want them to be very peaceful and in the zone kind of thing. And I'm like, but if I'm not in the zone, like, the way I shuffle my cards is one of the ways I get in the zone. If I'm not in the zone, how the heck are they going to, get anything from this reading? If I'm all over the place because I didn't take that 2 extra minutes to shuffle the way I need to shuffle, they're not going to get the reading that they deserve. And that's just kind of how I feel about it, in both a ritualistic approach to tarot and both and also delivery. It really is a balance, and an equal exchange. It's not all about them. It absolutely is not all about them. And it's not all about you either, because obviously we're trying to be healers, we're trying to be little therapists, we're trying to be supports for people in their time of trouble. I think that's the best part of being a tarot reader, is that you're trying to help people. Um, so as far as how I balance that, it can be really tricky. I think I don't spare anyone that stuff. If there's a need to do it, I do it. I think if I'm looking at a card in a spread and I am getting a certain vibe from it, or I just keep thinking about a certain aspect of it that has to do with the philosophical background of it, I will tell the person, like, I think the card is trying to say this because, traditionally one of its more philosophical meanings is this. And I try to frame that philosophical thing in a way that's obviously accessible to whoever I'm reading for. I either try to ground it in a real life example, or or in a religious system that I think they might be aware of. A lot of the people I read for locally are some form of Christian denomination, and I myself consider myself some kind of Christian-esque thing, conglomerate, whatever the heck. Um, and I try to frame it in those terms so that they can grasp it easier. Because obviously, if I tell someone, you have a lot of cards that represent Tiferet, and leave it at that, obviously that's not going to do anything. If I then say to that person, you have a lot of cards that have to do with Tiferet, which on the Tree of Life, which is a diagram that kind of tries to categorize life, basically. Tiferet tends to represent beauty and harmony, and it also represents the sun. So, you might be in a very kind of self-activating kind of phase in your life right now, but you're doing it in a really balanced way. I try to just really generalize it. I certainly don't want to give a full lecture in a reading because it's not the time or place for that. That's what videos and blog posts are for. I have never really had a person that has outright said, "Don't tell me that stuff." I try to say it again in a way that keeps them engaged, that keeps them understanding. And I think whether or not they understand everything you say when you talk about the philosophical stuff, I don't think whether or not they understand it is important. I think as long as they understand, of course, the general message of your reading. But if they don't understand the little specifics, the kernels of philosophy that you're trying to give them, I mean, so be it. It's not for everyone. And everyone learns at different rates and absorbs this kind of information at different rates and through different lifetimes and experiences. I'm sorry, my eye is still dreadfully itchy. Um, and I think what is good about that, or what is okay with that, is that either way, by bringing Aquarian's attention to the fact that there are um, more subtle aspects to the reading, that there are more profound elements at work in your reading, you're at least bringing their attention to the fact that, well, A, that their situation is valid, um, that their situation is more profound than they might think it is, because I think a lot of people go into tarot readings and want to know, one of a few things, love, money, career, um, movings, things like that. A lot of people who want tarot for just practical things want only a few things, and again, they don't want necessarily all this stuff. But all those situations are really reflections of a greater truth. It's very much like Plato's cave allegory. Um, to explain it in Kabbalistic terms, we look, living in Malkut, we look at the shadows of Yesod and believe them to be the only reality. But when we step outside the cave, we realize that those are all just shadows, and that the real truth is contained in Tiferet, the sun. The real sun, the source of light and life, is really, a source of reason behind the things that happen to us, and is the source of reason behind the courses of our lives. And no matter how small the phases are, um, everything has some kind of meaning or connection or purpose to it that is a Tiferetic, I guess, for lack of a better word, kind of meaning or essence or energy. And to get to that level of Tiferetic understanding, you do have to frame things in terms of religion or philosophy, and then try to reground them in Malkut so that people can practically understand that stuff as best as you can. And it might be something that they need to meditate on their own time for a month or however long. It doesn't have to be something that they understand right away. I think as long as you lay down the firm foundations of things, that's important. And I also think that um, using the philosophical stuff can be much more empowering. And I guess this is a good place to segue into another question. I don't mean to make this video too long. Um, I always try not to, but it never works out the way I planned. But I got this other question on a totally different video, but I think it really applies. Um, the person wrote on the Thoth versus Waite Smith deck video that I did. They wrote, that Crowley sounds, from your description, like a bit of an arse, frankly, and Thelema very much an excuse to cull people who don't measure up. Thoth itself is a deck that I find a bit odd. I don't pretend to understand it, though I get the symbols, astrology, etc. I actually find readings with it rather dire and depressing. Maybe that's the point, the so-called unvarnished truth. You do make learning it properly sound near impossible, which puts me off trying, really. Um, this comment was a fair comment. It sort of depressed me because that's certainly not my goal. If anything, I want to try to motivate people into believing, and which is true, that they can, deal with this kind of stuff. I think, um, as I always say, religion is hard. Religion is hard. Spirituality is hard. It is not for the type of person who's going to give up after a month. It really isn't. And you know, it I think tarot is the same thing. I mean, tarot is part of the spiritual arts, as yoga is, as prayer is, as whirling dervishes are. I mean, anything. All of these things are part of the spiritual arts, so to speak. You know, it could be anything. Whatever gets you in that zone for you is it can be considered a spiritual art. But I think particularly with tarot, the more obvious things, where you're literally dealing with the metaphysical and the unseen, and the unknown. It is important to remember that it should be hard. Its difficulty, to me, validates it, and vindicates it. Because there's nothing worse than a tarot deck that's so easy that someone who doesn't know any better, a skeptic, can look at it and say, this is BS, and this is just fruity, schmaltzy crap. In my last video I said I hate schmaltz, and I do. Death to schmaltz. I hate schmaltz. I have no stomach for it. And the same thing, for me at least, applies with religion. I hate the touchy-feely, uh, endless, like, Care Bear stuff. I mean, religion is not necessarily about that. I think that was one of Crowley's big points, um, is that religion shouldn't be this kind of weak display of, you know, relative affection for your fellow human being. Like, there's so much more to it that also represents strength and vitality and life, and superiority. I think the difficulty that a lot of people have with Thelema is that it is unabashedly, um, elitist. It is. I mean, there's no way of getting around that. And of course, I don't consider myself a full-blown Thelemite. I don't think I ever will. Um, but there's something to be said for that isn't necessarily bad. I mean, don't we all want to strive for our best? Don't we all learn from our teachers and mentors to do our best, to strive for excellence and not mediocrity? I mean, watch the Olympics. These people bust their asses for years with grueling effort to achieve this goal, that is incredibly difficult to attain. And they are constantly talking about how you have to overcome your challenges and strive for excellence. And I think religion needs to be the same thing. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint. And it's also a marathon full of pitfalls, and so I do think the difficulty is something that we need to embrace, more than anything else. Um, and so if that means, holding querents up to some level of, some standard, of being able to grapple with this stuff, just as a way of giving them options and ways of interpreting this stuff, and also, just to give them the benefit of the doubt, to believe that maybe they can figure this stuff out. Maybe they can, understand it. And that is, you're doing that person a better favor by, I'll put it this way, you're doing that person a better favor by giving them carrots than you are by giving them French fries, or cookies. Like, we all love junk food, but we all know it's not good for us. I personally don't love raw carrots, but I know that that's a better alternative for my body than cookies, even though cookies are really freaking good. Um, it's the same thing. The easy stuff can be good sometimes, but it's not good all the time. And so in any reading, I think we do need to strive for a balance of, the general basic elements of any reading, what's going to happen, what has been happening, etc., with what it all means on a deeper level, and whether or not, I mean, you don't have to crack the puzzle right there for the person, and really it's that person's responsibility to crack the puzzle um, themselves of their own accord and power, but by bringing their awareness to that there is an underlying puzzle that requires their attention, you're doing that person a much better service. At least I think, I think that that gives that person much more power. And Mary Greer talks a lot about uh, creating readings that are empowering for the querent, and she does it in a totally different way. I mean, this is my personal approach of empowering a querent, and she does it much more from a therapeutic kind of way, and a much more holistic way. And so, if that's the route you want to take, I strongly recommend reading her books. I recommend reading Mary Greer anyway, just because she's sort of the matriarch of tarot at this point, and her stuff is very good and very well thought out, and comes from a very great uh, length of experience. Um, so that's one thing, and the other thing about elitism and spirituality and Thelema and all this, I think that's the way the world works. Look at evolution. I think that's the other big thing, is that survival of the fittest is simply the way the world and nature work rather, excuse me. Whether we like it or not. And especially in the modern era, where there are just blatant things like competition in the workforce and in life in general. We are a competitive species, but more so in this era than in any other, I think. Getting ahead is a huge part of living in the modern world. And I think that, again, to go back to the comparison of food and athletes, giving the athlete endless ice cream might make them feel really good emotionally because of all the fat content, of course. They might love that, but that's not going to help them win a gold medal, obviously. You know, intense diet and exercise is going to help them win that gold medal. And I think the same thing involves whatever challenges and problems we face and we turn to tarot for advice for. Diet and exercise, it's the same principle. The more difficult route is going to help us get out probably better and more healthfully, both spiritually and physically, um, than to take the easy way out and just say, this is the advice I have for you in a very general way, or this is what's going to happen, figure it out. Obviously none of us want to just say figure it out, but I do think it's our responsibility as people who are trying to mitigate between, the so-called spiritual realm and the physical realm, and communicate between the two. I think it is our responsibility to frame things in terms that are philosophical or religious or both, or even scientific. If you want to base your readings in a more naturalistic, biological way, like using terms like survival of the fittest, so be it, as long as you're doing it in a way that allows the person to access the information in a way that's fair. Again, it's as much about you as it is for them, but it is about them as well, of course, equally so. Um, to just sort of wrap it up, what the end part of this comment, I actually find readings with the Thoth deck dire and depressing, and the unvarnished truth, that was an interesting thing. Um, I've read that before in other forums and comments about the Thoth deck, and I don't know why that is. I think the Thoth deck will tell you pretty blatantly what's up. I think, especially when you read it for yourself, I think it does give you the unvarnished truth, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It does function much like the Tower, you know, uh, and sometimes it's a good thing, sometimes it's a bad thing. I think part of that does have to do with the artwork. I do think, especially comparing it to the the Waite deck. I mean, the Waite deck is the main colors in that deck are primary colors: red, blue, and yellow. A lot of yellow in that deck, and I find that garish. I don't like that at all. It's one of the big turnoffs for that deck, for me. But it does make for a brighter, more optimistic reading. You know, um, whereas the Tot deck is all sorts of different things, and when it's printed, it can often be very muted and more subdued than it actually was intended to be. But I do think that Lady Frida Harris and Crowley, in their attempts to display a much wider range of color, to go with kind of the Kabbalistic color scales, they create a more varied and more realistic depiction of the universe than the Waite deck, or of situations. You know, I think the universe does not consist of all puppy dogs and cupcakes, but it also doesn't only consist of tears and death. It's um, I realize I'm starting to say a lot in these videos, but I'm just trying to be very candid here. That always drives me nuts when you hear the same thing over and over again. So I'm sorry. Um, but the the top deck does give you more diversity, and I do think it depends on how open you are to the deck. If you're more receptive from the get-go to that deck, then it'll work for you. And again, the top deck is not for everyone. I think my big point in constantly comparing the two is is to is to just I'm so sorry, this eye, is to just bring home the point that as long as you're using a deck, A, that works for you, but B, that has some integrity to it, then that's good. That's a good thing. That's all I ask of the tarot community. I really, you know, I really I have strong, visceral dislike of anything that involves fairy decks, druid decks, uh, you know, like these bizarre new agey kind of decks that have no real philosophical system to ground them. Shit. Um, Obviously, there are multiple philosophical systems that the tarot can be based upon. If you're using a deck that is grounded in, say, Buddhist or Hindu or Christian or whatever, um, if you're using a deck that's grounded in some kind of philosophy or religion, power to you. And as long as you understand that system and are using that system in your readings and understandings of the tarot, that's all I ask. But if you're using a deck that's based on vampires simply because vampires are a fad right now, I mean, really? Do we really need another gothic vampire deck that doesn't really say anything about tarot and just makes tarot look about as valid as the Twilight series? I mean, really? Um, uh, Frankly, tarot gets enough flack in the world, from skeptics and people who think it's BS, why do we need to contribute to it more by using stupid decks? Stupid decks. I'll just call it that as it is. They're stupid decks. And the rider-waite deck is certainly not a stupid deck. I mean, obviously, it has a very clear system behind it. I just think that the way it presents that system is not as strong as the Thoth deck. I think that waite, you want to talk about insulting elitism. I think waite kind of saying flat out, like, I made this deck in a way that didn't focus on all that stuff because I didn't think people would get it. I think that's more demeaning than saying, okay, here's the book, here's the deck, read it, and it's going to be hard. You might not get it, but basically it's all here. And if you work hard enough at it, maybe you'll get it. And I give you the benefit of the doubt, and I assume that you will at least try and give your best effort. And everyone will interpret it differently. There's more fairness to that than saying, oh, none of them are going to get it unless they're part of a secret society and they've got someone explaining it for them, and then they can meditate on it on their own times. I mean, really, does that really capture the spirit of the democratic modern era? I ask you. Um, you know, it's just that's what peeves me so much about comparing the two. So again, the same thing applies to readings. To get back to the original question, the same thing applies to readings. you know, we must ask people to work with the results they give. No one wants to know that their querent has mindlessly digested the information that you just spent all this time collecting, and giving to them. That they've just mindlessly digested it and aren't really going to be able to do anything with it, and are just going to say, well, that's it. That's going to happen, and that's going to happen, and I guess I'm just going to wait to see it happen. And mind you, the stuff might happen, and they could be blown away by that. They could be really impressed by that. But that's not really necessarily giving them tools. I think giving them philosophy, saying to them, pointing out to them that there is a deeper meaning behind these readings, and behind their situations in turn, is much more powerful. Okay, uh, this was a really good question. I could talk more about it, but I'm going to try to cut it off there. If you have any of you if you have more questions about this topic, please let me know. Thank you, David so and so, for writing the question in the first place. Very good question. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure answering it, or trying to answer it. I don't really think there is a specific answer for it. So thank you again. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope it wasn't too long for y'all. Um, Anywho, thank you very much, and I will see you soon for a new video. Bye-bye.